This work says that the answer to the question about consciousness being confined to your skull is no, it's not. There is a kind of presence of mind and consciousness in the world.
We're here at the International Consciousness Research Laboratory in Princeton, which is the successor of the Pear Laboratory in Princeton University, to talk with Roger Nelson about consciousness and the Global Consciousness Project. Can you tell us how the project began and whose idea was it?
It has multiple sources. There's a history of experiments in laboratories to find out whether human consciousness can change sensitive instruments. And the answer to that question was yes. And we branched out from the laboratory to take the same kind of instruments into the field to talk to go to conferences or maybe a concert or a ritual of some sort. And what we found is that even though there was no intention on anybody's part to change the way the data were produced by random number generators, it would change very slightly if the group came together, if there was a kind of coherence and resonance in the group. So one of the questions that we began to ask was, what happens if the group is larger? What happens if the group is far away? And by a couple of easy steps, you get to think of the largest group imaginable, and that's the whole of the population of Earth. And in terms of distance, maybe it would be sensible to have these same kinds of detectors all around the world. So we built a network, which now has about 65 random number generators that are placed all over the world. And they run continuously, taking data that we then later analyze if there's a big event, like a great tragedy or a great celebration. And we find, again, that the data are not random, as they should be because of the design of the random number generators. Instead, they show a little bit of patterning.
And do you transfer the data back to here?
The random number generators, we call them eggs, which is a kind of simple thing. It really comes from the idea that we were creating something like an EEG, but for the whole world. My son, who was one of the programmers involved early on, said, well, think of it as an electrogaiagram, a kind of EEG for the Earth. We attach the device to a computer. The computer runs special software that collects the data and then sends it over the internet to the servers in Princeton.
And how is it then analyzed?
The data arriving in Princeton go into an archive that's now huge. It's 14 years worth of data. So it's basically a complete history of these random numbers taken every second, day after day, year after year. And naturally, therefore, we have data that corresponds to anything that happens in the world, any date or any time. So if a major event occurs, like the death of the Pope, New Year's, we look at New Year's every year. At midnight, people all over the world come together. We combine across all the time zones and ultimately across years, and we ask, does the data change? Is there any change in the data on New Year's at around midnight? And we find that there is. There's a kind of reduction in variability of the data. We get a pattern that looks like this with New Year's right in the middle. We have emergencies and tragedies, things like 9/11, which produce apparently fairly noticeable effects on this
This is the one which become, well, famous or
the 9/11 event is quite famous, yes. We have looked at it in depth because it was, a world-changing event. There's no question that people all over the world were affected with all kinds of emotions. At first, fear and anxiety and shock and so forth, and then later something like compassion, maybe. But in any case, we had a formal prediction for that, but it was just 4 hours around the time of the actual planes hitting the buildings and the buildings collapsing. But we looked at surrounding days. If you look at a week of data, you find that the data change on 9/11 in a very significant way. And the change actually persists for 2 days in the measure that we normally use. We weren't able to guess how to predict what would happen in the data. So we got only a small sample of that in the formal analysis. But looking at it, several different people, analyzing it with different perspectives, produce a very striking set of analyses, showing not only that there's big changes in the data, but they start occurring well before the first plane hits, which is a surprise to most people. It's a surprise to me, in fact.
How would you explain that?
Well, it's not something I really can explain. We can just describe it, and we can speculate. One of the possibilities is that if there is such a thing as a global consciousness, it might be like a normal human individual consciousness and have characteristics that are similar. And you may know that most people have heard of precognition or premonitions, where somebody may intuit that something's going to happen that's a problem, so they try to avoid the situation in which they'll be hurt. Or people have dreams about something occurring the next day, and the dreams apparently come true. One of the possibilities is for the Global Consciousness Project analysis of 9/11, showing that the data started changing in a pretty distinct way about 4 hours early, is that a global consciousness could have premonitions too. There are other possibilities. Around the time the data started changing, there are quite a number of terrorists, not just the 20 who were committing themselves to die, but another, who knows, 2 or 3 dozen or 100 leaders and helpers in that network. They knew what was happening, and that's the time of day they were preparing themselves.
Can I bring you back to the early beginnings at the Pear Laboratory? How did the research begin there? I heard or I read that it started with a student having an idea.
In the Pear Lab, one of the primary experiments was what we call the Random Event Generator Experiment, or REG. In that one, what we're doing is using a device, an electronic device, that's basically a high-speed coin flipper. It's producing thousands of coin flips, and we would take 200 coin flips and ask people to try to get the average for those trials that are happening every second to be higher than 100 or lower than 100 in 2 different conditions. And it turns out that over years, we're able to establish with high statistical certainty that when people intend to change the behavior of a random system, like the random number generators, there is a change. It's small, but it's something that's reliable enough that it's been replicated in many laboratories around the world. So the nutshell expression is intention interacts with physical systems. A very artificial condition in a laboratory, but then the same kind of work can be done in less artificial conditions. I mentioned before the field REG work, in which we take that same instrument out into the field and ask if people are emotionally connected, will the data change?
What is difficult for people to understand is how consciousness or thoughts could have an effect on a machine.
Right. The Pear Lab is a very interesting and very effective research program at a great university, Princeton University. And it came about because the dean of the School of Engineering was asked by a student to sponsor some research that she wanted to do to find out if human intention could affect random systems or random number generators. She was a good student and hadn't been able to get one of the regular faculty to sponsor her research, but Bob John, the dean, said, let's go ahead. You do good quality research, find out what the context and background is for this kind of work, do a solid experiment, and we'll see what happens. What happened was that the data showed an effect. And he, as a high technology person, said, if we're seeing an effect here, wouldn't it be a good idea to have a serious examination of questions like this? And so he gathered some funds to set up a laboratory, some people, including the laboratory manager, Brenda Dunn.
Was this funded privately?
Yes, it was privately funded by, for example, the McDonnell Foundation, which was created by James McDonnell, who started the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation. So he had been interested as a young person in these kinds of questions, and as a person building fighter planes in the cockpit of which there might be strong emotions on occasion, he thought it was sensible to do a serious examination of the possibility that such like powerful emotions of fear or anger, or for that matter joy, might change the way the cockpit full of potentially highly sensitive electronics might work.
The commonly accepted view nowadays is that our consciousness and our thoughts are confined to our brains and our bodies. What are the implications of your work for the understanding of us as human beings and our view of the world?
The work that we do is a little bit outside the mainstream. Maybe that's an understatement. It's, on the other hand, potentially just extremely important because it points to facts about human consciousness that need to be given some attention. In particular, a lot of people think that consciousness is just a kind of epiphenomenon. The brain is pulsing and you have consciousness. And other people believe that there is nothing, nothing but, kind of a physical world. But if there is such a thing as consciousness, it's going to be stuck inside my head and really just the brain wiggling or something like that. So this work says that the answer to the question about consciousness being confined to your skull is no, it's not. There is a kind of presence of mind and consciousness in the world. Otherwise, if it weren't so, these devices, which are just an electronic random coin flipper sitting on a table, it would just go on being random. But because a person comes with intention, is now interacting with it, you might say, we can understand that the interaction is real, that there's something that transpires between the human mind or consciousness and that device sitting on the table that shows rather clearly consciousness is extending out into the world.
Are there any signs that the results from your research are contributing to us changing our view of consciousness and the world?
It's a very interesting question to ask, whether there's been any progress, you might say, in having acceptance of this kind of work or having it produce anything of value in the world. And I think the answer to that is yes, but it's slow. There are more and more people in the great public, for sure, who are interested in these kinds of things, who believe that it's important for us to understand things like what's the effect of prayer? What does meditation really do? What is the meaning of love between people? what happens when you have a great meeting, when a whole bunch of people get together and they, afterwards, they look back and they say, wow, that was powerful. They didn't notice it at the time. Why? Because they were integrated as a group. So I think we're beginning to show that human consciousness is not only not confined to your skull, but it's interactive. If two people fall in love, their two consciousnesses, their emotional sets, interact with each other to produce something new, which is the couple. Neither of them is ever the same. And they have created something that didn't exist prior to that. Same thing with groups. When groups come together, driven perhaps by events out externally, or maybe come together to do a peace meditation to try to save the future for our children from yet more destruction. I think they create something. I think that the work is gradually spreading so that more and more people believe that what they believe or what they wish for is more likely to come into being than if they hadn't wished for it. That's not a very powerful statement on one level, but on another, it's definitive. What human consciousness may be about is creating something new in the world.
Why did you call it Global Consciousness Project? And what is global consciousness?
At first, we didn't have a name. Then we called it the Egg Project for a while, referring to the idea of an electrogaiagram. And then for the sake of a kind of expression of the intent, we decided on the name Global Consciousness Project. The idea really comes from Teilhard de Chardin and other writers from the last century who were talking about the evolution of human life, which many of us think is all finished. You know, we're already the ultimate of creation. But thinkers like Teilhard said, no, there's another stage. And his idea was that, in particular, we would create a noosphere. And the prefix means something about knowledge or knowing or intelligence. So a sphere like an atmosphere, but a sphere of intelligence. That would be the next phase for humanity. And I decided that it would be worth looking to see if there might be some little glimmerings of this new noosphere or global consciousness to be found.
There is obviously some criticism about the methods. What do you say to that?
Yeah, indeed, there are a number of criticisms that people bring. I think probably one of the most likely or frequent ones is that we do what's called data snooping. You look around in the data and you find some surprising divergence from a normal random behavior, and then you call that an event. But that's not what we do. Our protocol is very strict and simple. The data are present. We have data for any time, and so we look at world events. We look at news, and we identify something that might be a global event, bringing lots of people into the same emotional state. And we identify the beginning of that special time and the end of it, and then we extract the data that correspond to that segment of time, and that's the experiment. We do the analysis on just that little segment of data, and if there's an effect, we eventually will see that in that segment, and the one just like it from another event, and so on, we expect or predict there will be divergences or departures from expectation, and over the long run, that's what we see. But it's a formal experiment that's repeated, and we don't do the data searching kind of thing.
And what are some of the other surprising results?
Well, probably the primary surprising result in the project is that there is good evidence for an effect. All we're doing is taking data from random number generators, and it turns out that when we look at the data during times that are important to human beings, there's a little bit of correlation between these devices, which are designed to be random and to have no relationship to each other, And they're also separated by usually thousands of kilometers. These devices are spread all over the world in a network, and that network becomes correlated during times that when human beings are sharing compassion or sharing joy or sharing fear, that sort of thing.
Does this mean that all of the generators reacted at the same time?
Well, yes, in a way, it does mean that the generators all react at the same time in a certain sense. When we look at the individual devices, we really can't see much of an effect. The effect on them is too small for it to stand out in a statistical analysis looking at one device and then another one. But if we look at the pairwise correlations, and because we've got A with B, A with C, A with D, and so forth, we have a very large number, several hundred or a couple thousand correlations. And the average across all of that large number of correlations is just a little bit larger than it should be. The correlation exists, but it's very, very weak. It does imply that whatever it is in the world that's causing some effect is affecting all of the devices. Some are reacting one way, some another way, but the tendency is for them to react together.
What other events show the reaction?
Well, we've done about 400 of them, and there are a number of different categories. For example, terrorist attacks, not all of them of the magnitude of 9/11, but things like the bombing of the Golden Mosque in Baghdad. Not so very many people were killed, but it was a turning point in the war, you might say the kind of civil war going on in Iraq. That one produced a big effect. Accidental tragedies, things like a plane crash, which is, of course, unexpected. It's a big surprise, and there's a tremendous amount of emotion on the part of a pretty large number of people, not just the ones that are directly affected. We've seen a tendency for major accidents like that. Things like earthquakes, where not just any earthquake, but big ones, where a whole lot of people are hurt or killed. Those tend to produce effects also. Like, for example, the one in Haiti produced an effect not in proportion to the number of people who were hurt or killed, but definitely there was a disturbance in the pattern, or a disturbance of the randomicity to become a pattern. And shortly after that, there was another one in Chile, which created a little tidal wave, and so on. There are a huge number of different kinds of events, and we're basically dealing with a system that has such a small response, or a small signal, you might say, within a big sea of noise, that we have no way of telling which is the effect and which is the noise. I mean, it's just statistical algorithms and numbers flashing before us on the screen. So we can't really tell much from one event. But when we accumulate a large number of earthquakes, or a large number of terrorist attacks, or a large number of events that have some powerful effect on people, we eventually wind up with a story to tell from the statistics.
What are the future plans for your work and the project?
I'm still interested. I'm also sometimes interested in gardening. So what I'm hoping is that there may be some gradual shift of the project over to other people. And it depends on something like funding and, people interested enough to maintain the work. We already have a huge database, but we can always learn more if we have more data. So I'd like to see it continue. But there's another important kind of thing. I believe, in a way, I have a responsibility, as best I can do that, to tell people what this might mean. You know, what's the implication of this for each of us as individuals, or for groups that might want to try to make a brighter future, and so on. I think we are interconnect. And I think there really is a possibility that humans can do something you might call conscious evolution. We're, in some sense, too smart for our own good. We get into a lot of trouble because we're so clever and we decide to build everything that we think of building. But so far, there's not really much effort to try to evolve. And I think if we put our minds to it, we could do that, become more like the potential of human beings, but actually manifest.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Thank you.